Thank you so much, Rebecca. Can you hear me well? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for having me here today with you all. It's really a great pleasure. I hope you feel great after the coffee break. And so the topic that essentially I'd like to talk about today is about why it's important to engage communities in building technology that defends human rights on the internet, digital rights. And specifically, I'd like to describe this based on examples on how we've done it at Xynou, which is the organization that I work with. And the reason why we think that it's important to engage communities, especially when it comes to digital rights, is because control on the internet, whether in the form of surveillance or internet censorship, is ultimately political. It's a political problem that really needs a political response. And the reason why it's political is because many such cases are often politically motivated, and they usually target those who are questioning or challenging authorities, and often have the biggest impact on vulnerable communities around the world. And so if we are to defend human rights on the internet through the use of technology, we really need to ensure that such technology is not only used by impacted communities, but also shaped by those communities to ensure that it addresses their needs. I work with the Open Observatory of Network Interference, commonly known as UNI, not to be confused with UNI the pizza oven, which is a free software project that was born out of the Tor project 11 years ago. And our approach specifically to measuring internet censorship has been very community-driven, in the sense that we rely on community members around the world to contribute network measurements that help us understand internet censorship. Through this talk today, I'm going to share specifically how community participation has been essential in advancing our mission in defending a free and open internet, because I hope that through our examples that can maybe inspire other researchers or projects and learn and maybe use similar approaches when engaging communities as part of their work. As mentioned, internet censorship really is a political issue, and the reason why I say this is that when looking at network measurements from around the world over the past 10 years, we tend to observe a specific pattern, and that is that censorship events tend to emerge and increase during political events around the world. Frequently, we tend to observe more censorship during elections around the world. For example, in many African countries over the last 5-6 years, we've observed the blocking of major social media platforms on election day or during the elections. Frequently, such censorship events also include internet outages. Sometimes what happens is that they start to block access to social media platforms. Then maybe on election day, they shut down access to the internet entirely. And then maybe they resume to social media blocking for a few days again after the election. And this is something that is really observed worldwide a lot in recent years, to the point that an entire campaign is organized around monitoring elections for censorship. The Keep It On advocacy campaign is a global coalition of more than 200 human rights organizations fighting internet shutdowns around the world. And they have a project called Election Watch, through which they track elections around the world to monitor any potential internet shutdowns and censorship events and respond to them from an advocacy perspective. Internet censorship also frequently occurs during protests around the world. For example, last September, when mass protests erupted in Iran following the death of Mahsa Amini, we started to observe much more internet censorship in Iran in comparison to the past. As I'm sure you're all familiar, Iran has had one of the most pervasive levels of internet censorship worldwide for a very long time. But what changed is that once the protests erupted, they started blocking access to, they started increasing the blocking of encrypted DNS services. They started blocking access to social media platforms and instant messaging apps that were not previously blocked. They started blocking access to app stores and browser extension repositories, limiting people's ability to update their existing apps or install new tools that could be useful for censorship circumvention and for online privacy. And they also increased the blocking of various circumvention tools as well. And again, this is a pattern that is not only observed during protests in Iran, but also has been observed during protests worldwide, such as in Pakistan and in many other places around the world. These cases of censorship, given that they very clearly correlate with these political events, such as elections and protests, suggests that governments basically implement the censorship in an attempt to prevent people from organizing, from accessing information that contradicts their narrative. We also tend to observe more censorship during sensitive political time periods, such as during political transitions. This here that you can see is an example from Myanmar. Following the military coup in February 2021, what we started to see was that certain social media platforms were blocked a few days after the coup. Then there was an internet outage, a day-long internet outage on the 6th of February, and then there were nightly internet outages that were implemented like clockwork every night for several hours. The fact that these internet outages were implemented every night for 72 days suggests that it may have been an attempt to maximize the political impact of preventing the opposition from organizing, while at the same time minimizing the cost of the shutdown to the local economy. While the internet outages stopped 72 days later, the social media blocks remain in place. These are long-term blocks that have been in place for 2 years. And this was quite surprising, given that in previous years, we hadn't observed much censorship in Myanmar. So again, the timing of these censorship events really suggests that it is politically motivated. And the fact that the shutdowns ended and that the blocks remain, again suggests that they're trying to maximize the political impact while minimizing the cost of censorship. We also tend to observe more censorship during conflict, during times of war. For example, during the border clashes between Azerbaijan and Armenia last year, both countries blocked access to TikTok. But notably, once Russia invaded Ukraine, we start to observe a huge spike in censorship in Russia, primarily targeting news media websites, with most independent news media websites being blocked, both Russian and foreign. And we also start to observe the blocking of Twitter and Facebook and other platforms. And again, the timing of these censorship events suggests that Russian authorities implemented the censorship in an attempt to control the narrative surrounding the war. But censorship doesn't just emerge in countries like the ones that I mentioned. Actually, almost every country has some form of internet censorship. What differs is what is blocked and the impact of that block. And that can vary over time. There have even been some cases of politically motivated censorship even in Europe. For example, in Catalonia during the independence referendum in 2017, we observed the blocking of websites related to the referendum. There's also various other types of censorship in Europe, such as the blocking of a reproductive rights website, Women on Web, in Spain, and also in Italy, for example, a book publishing website is blocked. So this is just to say that as motivations can change, so may censorship. A lot of censorship appears to be politically motivated, and as politics change in countries around the world, so may internet censorship. And ultimately, a lot of internet censorship impacts vulnerable communities the most, marginalized communities. Through extensive studies around the world, we've seen that that a lot of LGBTIQ websites are blocked in numerous countries. We collaborated with Outright Action International and Citizen Lab on publishing a detailed research report documenting the blocking of such websites. But we've also seen the blocking of religious and ethnic minority websites in several countries around the world. And I think this is worth highlighting because when access to the internet is shut down completely, or when popular social media services or instant messaging apps are blocked, you're going to notice, right? Because a lot of people use these services. But when the websites of marginalized communities are blocked, how likely are we to notice such cases? How much do such cases get reported, especially in the countries where they're censored? And that is why we think that it's really important to measure censorship in order to increase transparency. In response to the political issue of online surveillance and internet censorship, a lot of incredible tools have been developed over the past decades such as Tor, Signal, and others, basically trying to, in a way, provide an alternative or a different internet where people can have more online privacy, security, online anonymity, and through which they can circumvent internet censorship. From my perspective, I view such tools as the political response, or part of the political response to this problem, because they're basically fighting back, providing the internet community with a safer and better way to sort of interact and live on the internet, which respects human dignity. And a lot of this is founded like in the idea of decentralization, free and open source software, and so on. But what I want to highlight is that while it is important to think about decentralization in terms of technology, I think it's also important to think about decentralization in terms of people, in terms of community participation, where users of technology are not just users, but they also help shape and design these tools throughout the process. And so why is community participation so important? I'm sure you've heard this many times, or I assume so, but the things I'd like to highlight is, on the one hand, by working with and interacting with people on the ground, you can gain very valuable context that is necessary for making your tools more useful and effective to them, and ultimately helping you advance your goals and your mission. It can help you with understanding the specific types of challenges the various communities face, and these challenges do and will vary from country to country depending on the political environment and the social context, and even the cultural context. But more importantly, by engaging communities, you're helping to ensure that your tool actually addresses the needs of the people that you're building the tool for. And if you're meeting their needs, then they're more likely to use the tool in the long term. They're more likely to promote your tool to the local communities, and therefore advancing your goals and your mission. And also, it's very important to ensure that there's a feedback loop, to ensure that you're constantly collecting feedback from communities on which types of features would be most useful to them, how you can make the tool more effective. But more importantly, community participation is about building trust. It's about building trust directly with your audience, with the local communities that you're building your tool for. And if you build this trust and these chains of trust, then they can be the best champions of your tool. And I say this because, for example, it is much more effective for someone in a specific country who's a community leader to advocate for our tool there than for me to go there and say like, oh yes, you should install Uniprobe. People are more likely to adopt a tool if it is recommended by someone that they already know and trust from inside their community. In terms of how to engage communities, well, the first question is, who is your audience? Or who are your audiences, plural? You may have multiple audiences, not just one. And I think in the digital rights community, that is often particularly the case. In our example, in our case, for example, our audience includes researchers, technologists, developers, circumvention tool projects, journalists, human rights advocates. And identifying all these different audiences is important because each of these different audiences has very different needs and will use your tool in very different ways. So the first step should always be that of identifying who are you building the tool for and what are their needs and how can you get them involved. And to sort of address this question, it's also worth asking, what are you trying to achieve with your tool? What are you trying to achieve with your research? What are ultimately the goals you want to achieve? What is the impact you want to have in the world? And that will also help inform who your audience is or could be. Once you've identified your audience, it's important to have communication channels where they feel safe and included, fostering a safe and inclusive environment. This means taking into account different cultures and making everyone feel encouraged to participate and that they can do so in a safe way. But more importantly, I think it's really essential to include your community directly in the design and development of your tool as early on as possible. Because rather than building a tool and then going to community and saying, hey, does this work for you? And then maybe they will tell you, actually, this is not even useful to us. And then you've spent all this time and resources in building something that maybe people don't actually need. So in order to ensure that your tool actually meets the goals that it's designed for, it really is important to engage the target audience, the community, from the beginning, maybe even as part of usability studies at the very early stages, to think about what exactly that they need, creating a prototype, sharing the prototype with them, getting their feedback, and basically improving upon it iteratively with your community engaged along the way. And it's not just a question of getting feedback once. You really want to ensure that there's a constant feedback loop to ensure that you're developing your tool in a dynamic way where you can constantly adjust it and make changes depending on the feedback you're going to get on an ongoing basis. And this is particularly important because a lot of these tools are built for environments that are constantly changing, that are very dynamic. And so maybe something that was useful and effective yesterday is not so much in a year from now. So you need to be able to constantly have that feedback loop and be able to make those changes to your technology. And by engaging communities in the design process of your tool from the very beginning, throughout all the stages, you can help them feel ownership over your tool. And I think that's really super important, because if they feel ownership of your tool, they really are going to be the best champions of your tool, and they're going to help bring impact for your project. So to go back to the field of internet censorship, internet censorship research really emerged in the late 2000s. There were a lot of great academic papers that were published at the time, and which still are, many of which were presented over the last days. And also there was this amazing project called the OpenNet Initiative, which ran from 2008 to 2012. Where basically they developed some software and had a global community of researchers who were running their network measurement tool locally, contributing data based on which they produced multiple research reports. And their approach and methods really helps set the foundation for what then became UNI, our project. While these efforts have been really important, what we identified as a sort of limitation was the fact that the software used to run the experiments and the data was not publicly available. The software was not open source. And so it wasn't very easy to reproduce these studies. It wasn't very easy to monitor internet censorship at scale independently as a researcher. These were all sort of one-off studies. And so in an attempt to make this scale better, particularly because censorship varies from country to country, it varies even from network to network within countries in many countries, and it varies over time. And what you really want to be having is long-term monitoring of as many different networks as possible around the world. That helped give birth to the idea of UNI, where the goal has been that of empowering decentralized efforts to independently investigate and respond to internet censorship around the world. And the reason why we say that we really want to empower decentralized efforts is because we don't want it to be the case that the public will have to rely on a few experts to inform them of what is blocked. I mean, that is helpful. That is obviously very important and helpful too, but it doesn't scale, because what if one of these projects stops? As did the Open Initiative, or what if, and while academics do produce a lot of cutting-edge research, usually that research is based on specific moments in time. So how can we build a system which is monitoring internet censorship nonstop over a long period of time globally? And so to do this, the idea was quite simple. The idea was, on the one hand, create free and open source software that anyone can install and run, so that anyone can measure internet censorship on their network. But you, for example, running a tool like this and measuring internet censorship is great, but then how do the rest of us discover what is blocked? So then the idea was that such measurements would automatically be sent to UNI servers and published as open data so that everyone can learn about internet censorship worldwide. So this would be basically a crowdsourcing model based on which internet users around the world can independently investigate censorship by running tests on their networks and contributing the data as open data in real time. And why all this data? Why collect and publish all this data? Well, the way we see it is that we want this data to support research and advocacy efforts. Research efforts so that we can all learn about internet censorship, but advocacy efforts so that we can fight internet censorship, so that we can help defend human rights when they are violated, particularly such as the examples that I mentioned before that target vulnerable communities, and generally help defend a more free and open internet. And so since 2012, which is when UNI officially launched, we have had the opportunity to collect and publish more than 1 billion network measurements from 241 countries and territories worldwide. And this is thanks to our global community. And all of this data, every day, every minute actually, it's increasing because the data is published in real time. So as we speak, we're probably having new measurements published from around the world. And this data set has really helped shed light on many cases of internet censorship over the last decade. Specifically, we created UniProbe, free and open source software for measuring various forms of internet censorship. Initially, this was a Python-based command line tool, but then we really, in order to engage community members around the world to use the tool, we prioritized on making the tool available on as many different platforms as possible. And this decision was strategic because, going back to the question about audiences, we were thinking, who would be interested in running a tool like UniProbe? And the answer was, well, human rights activists, human rights defenders who are interested in fighting internet censorship and defending freedom of expression. And these people are not so likely to be running UniProbe from the command line. So that is why, for example, we really wanted to make it available and as user-friendly for as many different platforms as possible. Android has been a big priority for us because in a lot of countries which experience a lot of censorship, internet users primarily use Android. And UniProbe itself includes a variety of different network measurement experiments designed to measure different forms of internet censorship. If we are to think about these experiments in terms of categories, in terms of what they're measuring, on the one hand, there's an experiment, web connectivity, designed to measure the blocking of websites. We also have experiments designed to measure the blocking of specific instant messaging apps. Specifically, we have tests for WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, Telegram, and Signal. We also have tests designed to measure the reachability of circumvention tools, specifically for Tor, Tor Snowflake, and Siphon. And we also have experiments designed to measure networks to detect, with a goal of identifying middle boxes and detecting any signs of network tampering. And we also have some experiments for measuring network speed and performance and video streaming. Those tests were developed in collaboration with MLab. But in designing all of these systems and these experiments, there are certain principles that guided our decisions in designing them. And these principles have been in place since the very beginning, and we've tried to improve upon them over time. And we feel that they're very important, especially if you're engaging people on the ground with the use of your tool, especially if those users are likely to be in high-risk environments where using your tool can be risky. So one of the main principles has been that of purpose limitation, so limiting the data only to what is sort of necessary for identifying and characterizing internet censorship. But at the same time, we want to ensure that we're protecting our users. We want to ensure that we're protecting their privacy as much as possible. And this presents some trade-offs in terms of how much or how well you can measure censorship. So for example, our lives would have been much easier if we were collecting PCAPs, but we're not doing that because we want to protect our users' privacy. And in terms of user safety, by design, UniProbe has never collected and does not collect any personally identifiable information. At least we do not seek to collect such information. And this has been a design goal since the very beginning because our tool is used by users around the world and including high-risk environments. We also want to provide as much control to the user as possible. We want them to have ownership over our tool. And this is again, important because we want them to be able to customize their use of our tool depending on their threat model, depending on their needs, depending on their goals. So it's important to be able to provide an extensible and customizable framework. And this also has been part of the principles driving the design development of our tools. We want the data to be open by default, and the reason for this is because, on the one hand, our mission, our goal, is to increase transparency of internet censorship around the world, but also because we want this data to serve as a public archive with longitudinal data that future researchers can refer to in order to understand how internet censorship was implemented around the world during our time. And but publishing the data is not enough. We want the data to be actionable. We want the data to be used. And thinking about that, we need to think about who do we want to be using the data. And this takes us back to the question of audience, where we want it to be used by researchers, by journalists, by human rights advocates, and so on. And so that means that we need to make the data as accessible and as usable as possible for all these different audiences. That is why Unidata is available in different ways. On the one hand, we provide a web interface, which makes it easier to navigate, for example, for journalists and human rights advocates. But we also provide the raw data in JSON format for data analysts and researchers who want to perform their own investigations. And when engaging people around the world, especially in high-risk environments, it's really important to think about any potential risks that may be involved, and about being honest with your community, being honest with your users, and inquiring their informed consent. And so, specifically, censorship measurement in itself can be risky for a variety of reasons. It can be risky because anyone monitoring your internet activity can see that you're performing these tests, which in itself can be viewed as a political action, that of investigating internet censorship. That in itself can be risky. But also the precise risks vary depending on the legal and political environment of each country. They vary depending on the personal threat model of each user, and so on. So when thinking about how to protect our users, on the one hand, we try to make our tools as privacy-friendly as possible based on the principles that I just discussed. But we also wanted to clearly communicate the risks to the user to ensure that they're aware and that they consent to using the tool nonetheless. So on the one hand, that involved publishing documentation where we provide in detail what the potential risks are, which we developed in consultation with lawyers, and which we have been updating as needed over the years. But more importantly, when thinking about acquiring consent, we didn't want to have like some long documentation that no one reads and they just tick, yes, I agree, without knowing what they agree to. We wanted to ensure that our users actually understand. And so that is why, for example, our tool includes a quiz. So when you install the app, a prerequisite to using the app is that you need to answer certain questions correctly. And these questions are some of the main questions that we've identified in relation to the potential risk. And so if you answer the questions correctly, demonstrating your knowledge and understanding of the potential risks, only then can you then proceed to running the experiments. And before I mentioned that we really want to make the data as accessible as possible. So one thing that we've done over the years is that we've launched a web platform called Uni Explorer, where the goal here is to enable journalists, researchers, human rights defenders, and the public at large to more easily navigate the data and learn about internet censorship around the world. This platform was originally launched back in early 2016. Since then, it has changed a lot. It has evolved a lot. This is a revamped version. And the changes that we've made have been based on community feedback all along the way. So how we present the data, how we communicate the data, what type of data to display, and so on, all of that has been based on feedback provided directly by community members. And when designing the revamped version, we started off basically by engaging our community in some usability studies where we provided the prototype and the initial designs, then we built it, we interviewed them again, and so on. And now Uni Explorer is arguably the world's largest open data set on internet censorship around the world, given that it consists of more than 1.5 billion measurements collected from, I think, more than 20,000 networks in 241 countries from 2012 to date. And the fact that it has this long-term 10-year, 11-year data set means that you can research internet censorship over time and identify trends and patterns and correlate censorship with other events. To enable our community to actually use an Explorer, we have various tools and features, one of which is the search tool. With the search tool, you can search through the measurements based on various parameters, such as the date range that you care about, such as the specific country, or the specific ASN, or the specific experiment. You can narrow down your search based on what you care about to more easily find what you're looking for. And what you can see here is basically every measurement, every row is an individual measurement. And if you click on each row, you can get access to the data. And in presenting the data, based on community feedback, what we've done is that we started by providing an overview of the result, such as the tested service was accessible, or it presented signs of blocking, or it's confirmed blocked, etc. And then from starting by providing an overview, we then gradually, as you scroll down the measurement page, provide more details. And we also provide the raw measurement data, which can be independently verified, downloaded, and analyzed. But I think one thing that I find personally very exciting about the search tool is that it has a filter for confirmed, based on which you're able to filter the data for cases where websites were automatically confirmed blocked. And I think this is a very powerful feature because you can use this to check which websites are automatically confirmed blocked around the world, whether for a specific website or comparatively in countries and so on. A limitation here, though, is that currently, we only automatically confirm cases of website blocking when a block page is served, and we've added the fingerprints of the block page to our database, or when DNS resolution returns an IP associated with censorship, which is also added to our database. But going forward, we're working on improving our methods to automatically detect more cases. And speaking of community involvement, another feature that we've launched is this one, where basically for every UNI measurement, which you can find on UNI Explorer, there is a verify button. And if you click on the verify button, you can help verify the data in that specific measurement. You can tell us if, based on the measurement data, if the result is annotated correctly. For example, if in fact it is blocked, if the data shows that it's blocked by means of TLS or whatever. And by submitting this feedback to us, you can help us improve our data analysis methods and improve our heuristics for confirming cases of censorship. So this is another crowdsourced way of improving the data quality of measurements. And this is something we probably wouldn't have even thought of implementing if it was not requested to us directly by our community. So this is to highlight that there's a lot of different cool things you can do that maybe you wouldn't think of if you didn't have this constant engagement with people on the ground. For those of you interested in performing your own analysis based on UNI data, so this is like for programmers, for researchers, data analysts, you can download raw UNI data in JSON format from the UNI API. You can also fetch UNI data from our Amazon S3 buckets. For lightweight queries, we recommend using the API, but if you want to perform batch analysis, please fetch the data from the S3 bucket. So community participation in practice can look very different depending on your goals, depending on what you're trying to achieve, and depending on your audience, and depending on their needs and their goals. For example, in UNI's case, community participation looks like running UniProbe to contribute measurements, testing UniProbe, localizing UniProbe to make it available for more communities around the world, reviewing UNI's code and contributing new experiments, helping us improve our experiments to improve our capability to detect censorship, providing feedback and feature requests. A lot of these things maybe will be common for many other projects and are common for other projects such as Tor, especially that they have an entire community program through which you're doing a lot of incredible work on collecting feedback and making the tools more useful to local communities. But again, the details will really vary depending on your project and your goals. In our case, one thing that is really important to us is that we want community members to lead censorship measurement efforts in their communities. We don't want it to be the case that everyone has to depend on UNI to tell them what is blocked in their country. Instead, we want people to feel empowered to run the tools, use the data, engage others, and do that independently in their own communities. And this is why also community participation can include facilitating UNI workshops for your own community. And also, ultimately, we want people to be able to use UNI data as part of their work, to use it as part of research, advocacy, journalism, and sometimes even court cases. But again, what community participation looks like will vary depending on the project. So to enable our community to make use of our tools and our data, we've really prioritized on creating multiple different resources that help facilitate this process. For example, we've published numerous user guides and documentation explaining how to use our tools and UNI data. We've also published screencasts and other videos. We've created a free online course that anyone can take and which has been localized in multiple languages. This course includes various different videos through which you can learn how to use our tools and data. And it also includes hands-on exercises that you can do in order to practice using the tools based on real-world scenarios. And this is something we're particularly excited about because instead of depending on us to travel to facilitate workshops or having others do that, this can help support independent learning for so many more people around the world. And we also provided an outreach kit, which basically includes workshop slides that anyone can download and adapt depending on their audience and the workshop they want to facilitate, and many other materials that help communicate what the tools are about in order to engage their local communities with censorship measurements. But what has really been crucial towards our mission and towards our goals has been that of forming a partnership program. And the reason behind this, again, was sort of strategic in the sense that the idea was like, okay, we want our audience, we want researchers and human rights defenders to use UNI data. So the question there is, who out there cares about the same things we care about? Who also cares about measuring, researching, understanding, and fighting internet censorship? And for us, the answer was other digital rights organizations. And more specifically, digital rights organizations who, as part of their priorities, as part of their goals, they aim to defend freedom of expression and fight internet censorship. So we launched this partnership program and we reached out to relevant organizations with the goal of collaborating and forming these long-term collaborations on measuring and researching internet censorship in their countries. And the idea was that our partners would serve as UNI ambassadors for their local communities. So that way, if someone wants to learn about UNI in any country, they can reach out directly to our partner, that they would have ownership over our tools and they would really lead these efforts in their community. And this goes back to the point we were discussing before about trust and chains of trust. And you can really build that through partnerships with other organizations or groups who are working towards the same goals as you. And since 2016, we've had the opportunity to form partnerships with 44 digital rights organizations around the world. And these partnerships have really helped us to, on the one hand, increase the measurement coverage from all of these countries. On the other hand, improve the quality of the testing because they helped inform which websites and which services should be measured. And also helped advance reporting on censorship events around the world. But in addition to creating our own network, we also try to find opportunities to join other existing networks with whom we share the same values and goals. That is why we also joined the Keep It On advocacy campaign that I mentioned earlier, which is a global coalition of human rights organizations fighting internet shutdowns. And specifically, the way that we joined the campaign is by supporting this advocacy community with UNI data that can be useful for confirming censorship events that they can then use as part of their campaigns. So similarly, when thinking about how to advance your projects and engage communities, it's definitely also worth considering which existing networks you can join and support. So as a result of global UNI participation, this has had a lot of different results on many different levels. One result, which we're very excited about, is the localization of our tools. Both UniProbe, the tool for measuring censorship, and UniExplorer, the open data platform with internet censorship, have been localized in multiple languages. And this is really thanks to community members participating and helping out with the localization process. Localization is not just in terms of translation, but it is also in terms of helping ensure that the way that certain things are communicated in the tools makes sense within the context of the local community, and basically adapting it so that local communities can use the tool more effectively. Also, many community members around the world facilitate their own UNI workshops, leading community engagement efforts and engaging their communities. And as a result of this has also helped us make UniProbe itself more resilient to accidental and deliberate blocking. For example, community members pointed out to us in certain countries that there were instances where UniProbe didn't work. Some of those cases were not due to blocking, some of them were, but we probably wouldn't have discovered those cases if we didn't have this constant communication channel and feedback loop with our community. And as a result of that, we added backend proxy settings that now help make UniProbe work in more places. As a result of all the previous points, like localization, improved UniProbe resiliency, and more outreach, this over the years has led to a very big increase in global UNI measurement coverage. And by increasing the global measurement coverage, that has improved ours and your ability to investigate and confirm cases of censorship around the world. In practice, it has also led to much more reporting. Over the last 10 years, we've had the opportunity to publish numerous research reports documenting cases of internet censorship based on the analysis of UNI data. And many of these research reports were written in collaboration with our partners and other community members who helped provide relevant context and explain a lot of the questions that we were not able to explain. For example, UNI data can only answer some questions, as in what is blocked, how it's blocked, when it's blocked, etc. But it cannot answer questions like why is it blocked, or what is the impact of the blocking, in which conditions did this happen. And this is where community members can really contribute and help make your research more meaningful. But apart from supporting our own research efforts, UNI data has also supported independent third-party research efforts. For example, it has supported academic studies, it has supported the research efforts of many other digital rights organizations around the world. For example, Xynou project, which is one of our partner in Malaysia, they recently published 8 research reports based on UNI data. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go through the next ones quickly. UNI data has also supported advocacy efforts, such as that of the Keep It On campaign. And in a few cases, it has also supported legal cases. This is an example from when, back in 2017, social media and news media websites were blocked in Pakistan during protests. And local groups filed a petition to the Islamabad High Court and used UNI data as evidence of the blocking. UNI data has also supported other third-party projects, for example, when integrated into platforms like Athena, the ISOC Pulse project, the Berkman Center Internet Monitor, and others. But all this data really depends on the types of experiments that you're running. And so we try to ensure that our experiments are, on the one hand, informed by censorship needs, but by censorship trends, but also that community feedback and needs are taken into account when designing these new experiments. And this has, for example, has resulted in our UniProbe signal experiment, which has enabled us to measure the blocking of signal around the world. It has also resulted in our new DNS check experiment, which measures the blocking of encrypted DNS. And this was a study that was done in collaboration with community members in Iran, Kazakhstan, and China. And it really would not have been possible without this collaboration. And it resulted in the publication of a research paper, which, to our knowledge, is probably the first study measuring the blocking of DOT and DOH in these countries. And now we have shipped this experiment, and so encrypted DNS blocking is measured worldwide. It has also informed the development of our methods, for example, for measuring cases of throttling by analyzing TLS handshake data. And I think I'm out of time.
Let's thank our speaker. So I know you wanted some time for questions, so let's do that. We already have questions on the Zulip, so I'm going to ask them first, just because you guys all have the rest of the day to find Maria. So the first question is, and I'm supposed to disregard it because you already answered it. So the second question is, it's a very technical question. In reference to the verify the measurement button, what does will that data simply be enriched in the JSON with the extra field for researchers, or does it actually change the characterization?
It can potentially help change the characterization. We recently launched this feature a few months ago, and so we're still in the phase of collecting the data and trying to see how useful it is, and then based on that, the goal is to eventually improve the characterization and the analysis of the measurements. I don't know, Artur, if there's something you want to add to that.
Yeah, so it will be displayed on the measurement page itself, and then the idea is that we will be using this for basically as a ground truth to evaluate our analysis heuristics, so that if we see, a lot of people have told us this measurement is flagged wrong, we can, tweak the analysis and make it better, so that hopefully it will score it properly.
Yeah, I'm just asking, like, I was just thinking if I'm like the bad guy, the censor in a country, I would just try to poison Uni with a bunch of fake data because the client is open source and I can just like claim websites that are not blocked are blocked and claim websites that are blocked are not blocked and just make the data set useless. Have you guys seen attacks like this? And are there any ways you guys are thinking of mitigating just fake data getting into the data set?
Thank you for the excellent question. It is definitely something that we are concerned about and have been concerned about for a long time. To our knowledge, this hasn't happened yet, but we are aware that this is definitely a big risk and one that we're very concerned about because it wouldn't have impact. It would have impact not only on Uni, but potentially also on our users who are using the data. And so to mitigate this, essentially, we've actually just submitted a funding proposal to work with a cryptographer to solve this problem, because basically the challenge here basically is like, how can we verify the measurements while protecting the privacy of our users? So we want to solve this problem cryptographically speaking, and yeah, basically have something that we're referring to internally as probe ID, to have a cryptographic way of verifying the measurements, but without having it linked to specific users. And by verifying the measurements, we're able to annotate certain levels of trust for certain measurements and say like this probe or these measurements coming are trustworthy, these ones have a low level of trust and therefore may be disregarded, and so on.
That makes sense, thank you.
Hey, thanks for the talk. Hi, I'm here. I was super intrigued by when you talked about like your data principles, and then afterwards that you really want informed consent, that like users who take measurements know about the risks. So I was wondering whether you can talk a bit about like this risk assessment that you have done to identify those risks, because I imagine it to be like really challenging. And my question was also whether this was also done with community participation, and whether these risks or this like quiz that you showed, whether this is also like localized, because I can really imagine that your like risks are very different depending on like where you are and like, yeah, how you handle that. Or if you just have like, I don't know, some documentation about this that you can point to, I would be super grateful.
Thank you so much also for the excellent questions. So in terms of performing the risk assessment, I guess it's first worth noting that we probably are not in a position to do a thorough risk assessment for every single country because, well, our team itself, we're not lawyers, and also the risk is very different in every country in the world, and it changes over time in every country in the world. So doing risk assessments should be a dynamic process specialized for every given country, and it should be done by local experts. So this is just to say that unfortunately we're not in a position to provide a risk assessment for all countries in the world and for all users, also because they all have different threat models. What we did do though is that we collaborated with lawyers, but also with many community members, where basically on the one hand that was evaluating the risk associated to our testing. So, for example, for every single experiment that we have, what is the data that's collected, what are the potential risks associated with the specific testing, and the details there really vary from test to test. Also, the risks are in terms of submitting the measurements to UNI, because maybe even submitting the measurements to a server, to a foreign server, can in itself be viewed as sending local measurement to a foreign agency, so there's that risk there too. And then there's also the risk associated with the publication of the data. So on the one hand, that is a question of what data is published and the risk, the question around risk there is, could that data potentially be used to identify a specific user? Could that bring risk to a specific user? And to minimize that, that is why, for example, we don't collect any person identifiable information, to try as much as we can to make it hard to identify users based on public data. And also, yeah, so based on these various parameters, so in our risk documentation, we outline these things. But we also acknowledge that the risk also depends on the political environment of a country, it depends on the laws of a country. For example, to our knowledge, there is no country which has laws specifically prohibiting network measurements. However, if you're a high-profile activist who's already under surveillance, maybe using a tool like Uniprobe could be an excuse to prosecute you for your, I don't know, anti-corruption work or whatever, and maybe that could be done under vague and broad national security laws. So it's very hard to know and to predict what the risk can actually entail for different users around the world. What we try to do in the documentation is describe precisely what I just said, describe what the risk could entail, and basically to encourage our users to speak to experts in their country, and especially because the advice will vary person to person depending on their threat model. And then in terms of the informed consent, so yeah, the Uniprobe app is translated, it's localized in, I think, 47 languages, many languages, and so that also includes the informed consent procedure, so that is also translated. Unfortunately, the questions in the quiz cannot be specific to every use case for the reasons that I just mentioned, but rather they're trying to capture some of the basic things. So one of the questions is that anyone who's monitoring your internet activity will know that you're running Uniprobe, just the way they know all the other software that you're running. And that is not obvious to a lot of people. So sort of making it obvious and saying, like, you know, regardless of whether you're publishing the data or not, regardless of what you're running, your ISP or your government will be able to see that you're running Uniprobe. And then the second one is basically about being aware that by default, your test results will be published as open data. You have the possibility to opt out, but it will be published if you don't opt out, basically. And so informing the user of that, we feel, is also very important. And these questions were selected based on what we view as some of the overarching risks that probably apply to users globally, but then how you can customize the tool varies from case-by-case basis. We've also tried to address this problem from a technical perspective, in the sense that we've tried to make Uniprobe as customizable as possible. We've tried to provide users as much choice so that they can customize how they use Uniprobe depending on what they feel comfortable with and depending on their threat model. So for example, if you don't feel comfortable measuring a long list of websites that may include websites that are maybe banned in your country, you can instead limit your testing to only running a speed test. Or for example, if you don't want your network measurements to be published, you can opt out from publication of measurements. So we try to provide users as much choice depending on, yeah. I hope that helps answer. Yes?
For many causes like human rights, women's rights in some countries, democracy, censorship is bad, and probably joining some communities to fight against censorship, that's good. But for other causes like hate speech, conspiracy theory, terrorism, probably censorship is good there, and I don't want to join the community to fight against this censorship. At some point in your talk, you said that there is the why such a thing is censored, and probably including such a thing in your data would be good. How far did you go in this?
Thank you for the great question. So the why part is really contextual. Because every case of censorship, the answer to the question why will vary. For example, maybe in some cases the why is related to some political situation. Maybe in other cases the censorship is implemented for legal reasons in compliance with certain laws. Maybe the censorship is comes from a cultural context. There's many different reasons that may motivate the implementation of internet censorship. We don't answer the why in the measurements, because doing that automatically for so many cases and measurements doesn't scale, because there really are like more than 1 billion measurements, and looking into everyone, yeah. But what we have been thinking about that we'd love to do at some point is enrich Uni Explorer, where maybe what we could do is for example, in the country pages of Uni Explorer, engage our community members to contribute to those pages and help basically write text that can provide context and which can therefore help answer some of the why questions. But because why censorship is implemented really varies from a case-to-case basis, that is why, for example, in our research reports, we try to address the why question there, where we're looking at a specific case study, and where it's not us saying why censorship is implemented in a different country, but rather it is our local partner or other local experts who are contributing towards answering the why part. But you're right to say that censorship itself is not a black and white issue, in the sense that there might be some cases where maybe some communities feel that it's justifiable, for example, if it involves hate speech. And that is why we think that ultimately there needs to be more public debate. There needs to be more transparency. And so I say fight internet censorship, but when I say fight, for us at least, from a values perspective, we're mainly referring to cases that involve the blocking of human rights websites, news media websites, platforms that people should have access to from a human rights perspective. For some of these other more, let's say, tricky cases, we really think it's about transparency. And I say transparency because there really isn't, in the sense that identifying cases of censorship and confirming them can actually be very tricky. It's very hard to distinguish intentional censorship from all the other reasons that may result in a service not being accessible. And usually governments are not transparent about it. So it's hard for the end user to know if the block is intentional or not. So our main motivation is to increase transparency, to support public debate about these topics.